Claragh Mulhern is Principal Planning Advisor in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage.
For me, the really important one is the new Urban Communities Task Force, because it's clearly a priority.
At the end of 2025, I caught up with Claragh to get an update on the implementation of the Planning and Development Act, what the government's recent housing plan and infrastructure report mean for planners, and what people can expect in 2026 in terms of legislation, renewables and development plans. We also discussed her career to date, her day-to-day work in the department, and why Ireland's EU presidency in the second half of 2026 comes at a crucial time for planning. Claragh, thank you very much for doing this.
No problem, Sean. Pleasure to be here.
So the first question that I wanted to get a sense of really was your career to date, and I suppose why you studied planning in the first place and where you studied planning and then where you went after.
Yeah, sure. I suppose in terms of maybe why I studied planning, I've always had an interest in, I suppose, the world around me and maybe why things are the way they are, both in terms of the built environment and the physical environment. And I suppose I kind of started my studies in UCC, studying geography and history and European studies, and that gave me a really good feel for maybe, I suppose, the things, all of the factors that are involved in ultimately, I suppose, what we're trying to do as planners, both from the physical and built environment perspective, but also maybe some of the institutional and political arrangements that feed into that. And so that, I suppose, formed the basis for my decision for then moving on to studying planning in UCD. And I did the Masters in Regional and Urban Planning in UCD and graduated there in 2003. And really, I suppose, from an inspirational perspective, it was probably Michael Bannon that was the final kind of push to studying in UCD. I was in UCC in my final year and I suppose thinking about what I would do next. And he came to talk to us about the MRUP programme. And it just really seemed to fit exactly where my interests lay. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good route for me. And the rest is history. I really enjoyed my time in UCD, and really it's all moved from there, I suppose, in terms of that grounding in planning, but very much from the geography and history background, as I say. So that's how I got started.
Was this in the days of the enormous kind of MRUP classes?
I was the second year of the enormous MRUP class. Yes, that's right. So I suppose that was probably part of it, in that there was a real push to getting more people into the profession at that point, which was great. And I think there were 52 of us maybe in the class in UCD at the time, mingling with the architects, of course, and you know, a really kind of enjoyable experience in Richview, but a real sense of excitement in terms of kind of maybe what planning could do and the role that planning could play at that time. And, you know, some of the lecturers that taught me in UCD are still there, and you know, it's really great to see, I suppose, the kind of the continuation of that expertise. But it's constantly changing, of course, and new people coming in all the time. And of course, from an educational perspective, at that time, UCD was the only place that you could study planning as a master's in Ireland at the time. And it's great to see that that's expanded as well now beyond that programme into others, and, you know, broadened out the level of expertise and academic involvement also.
We might be going back to those enormous classes again, probably, hopefully, yeah. And where did you go after the MRUP then?
There was a great level of excitement and big numbers coming out. There probably wasn't really the capacity right then when I graduated for everybody who was graduating in the sector in Ireland at the time. So I suppose in terms of maybe expanded job opportunities, but also I suppose I had an interest at the time anyway in seeing maybe how things were done elsewhere. I moved to London at the time and started my career in local government in Harrow Council, so kind of, I suppose, suburban or outer London at the time, and really, got a brilliant grounding for the profession working there. I had a couple of really excellent mentors that really taught me, I suppose, what being a planner really meant on the ground, both in terms of, you know, bringing good planning practice into it and, you know, working with communities, working with applicants. And for those first couple of years, that basis in terms of the development management side of things was a really great platform for me, I suppose, in terms of then moving on. I actually travelled for a while after that, worked as a planner in Australia while on my travels, which again was great exposure and great experience in working in a very different system. And then came back to London again. I thought I might end up back in Ireland at that point, but wasn't quite ready. So ended up back in London, again working in a local authority on the DM side for a little while, and then eventually ended up in Westminster Council, where I stayed for quite a number of years. Started in development management, and again working in a really interesting environment, central London, dealing with all of the exciting types of projects that are going on there, some really high profile projects. And moved on then within the council from working on development management to more the policy side, and I suppose as kind of part of the management team in the local authority. And that, I suppose, gave me a wider breadth of experience working with central government as well as part of that role. Really provided me with a very varied set of skills. And then I moved back to Ireland in 2019 and joined the department, and things have moved on from there to my current role.
And I didn't get a job in Westminster Council in 2008, but I'm not bitter about it.
Nothing to do with me.
Oh yeah, I've moved on from that. So as Principal Planning Advisor now in the Department of Housing, what is a typical day as a Principal Planning Advisor? And maybe just can you talk about the shape of the planning team or the planning section in the department now, because that has continued to evolve and change as well.
It's probably fair to say, Sean, that there's no typical day. And that's actually part of what I really enjoy about the role. Every day is different. It's such an exciting job to work in, because I suppose it probably has evolved, and I think we have a role now across government, very, very much, I suppose, involved in some of the really core priority objectives for government and for society. We clearly have a very strong role in what's happening in terms of the housing side of things and supporting housing supply and delivery, but it's across government. There's engagement across all other departments, whether it might be renewable energy, employment, everything from health, education. It's a very varied job to do. And for me personally, that involves on a day-to-day basis working within the department, within the planning division. I have a role that again is quite diverse in terms of supporting the work that others are doing across the planning division. And there's colleagues that are focusing on legislation, there's colleagues focusing on the performance and improvement of the planning system, governance within the system, of course, and it's engaging with all of them, and in terms of programmes and funding streams across the department and government. But beyond the division and the department itself, it's working with colleagues in all of those government departments, and that might be, attending senior officials groups meetings or engaging with ministers across government in terms of, I suppose the role that planning, policy and legislation can play to support the delivery of those objectives. And of course then, beyond government, of course, it's engaging with everyone in the sector and beyond, all of the key stakeholders in the sector. We obviously are responsible for policy and legislation, but the delivery happens outside of the department and government, of course. The local authorities, the regional assemblies and Commission Planola play an absolutely key role, the OPR, of course, and others. And then in terms of, the engagement with the stakeholders beyond that, that's all part of the job and is a really important part of the job, getting that input and feedback, and that informing how we develop policy and legislation is crucial. So I suppose in terms of the team specifically, I lead the team of professional planners working within the division, and we're responsible for a huge amount of work in terms of policy development in particular. That we're responsible for the National Planning Framework, both in terms of preparing it, revising it and overseeing the implementation of it through the system. And that brings in, of course, all of those other policy areas that I mentioned, but also, developing other policy, previously ministerial planning guidelines and now national planning statements as we move forward, and then supporting and advising colleagues working on other aspects of the system in terms of the professional and technical advice, to guide and shape that work.
And I think we'll touch on as many of those things as possible in the next while. The first big piece of work I think that I wanted to talk to you about was the Planning and Development Act, and you might have to kind of hold my hand as we go through this, because I'm talking about primarily the Planning and Development Act 24, but there has been amendment legislation and I think there maybe is more to come. So can you just, I suppose, explain where we are with the 24 Act as it was passed and where that sits and how far along that process is, and then also I think it would be useful if you could just weave in what has changed and whether it's changing that legislation or the 2000 legislation and just paint a picture of, I suppose, where people are, what people can expect to see, what is going to be changing in the next couple of months.
No problem. Yeah. And look, I think you've referenced it, Sean, change, it is, I suppose, something that we're very conscious of. This is a very interesting and challenging time for everyone working in the profession, of course, with the degree of change that's happening. And I suppose it's very important that we communicate, what those changes are and that we all work through them together. And I suppose in terms of, obviously, the Act itself that was finalised in October of 2024, obviously there was a relatively long lead-in period to that itself, a 3-year review process. And I suppose the intention behind that was very clearly to consolidate the legislation and reinforce maybe some of the aspects that required reinforcement and refinement, and really to deliver the very strong and enhance the very strong plan-led approach that we have to development in Ireland. And I suppose that's, in terms of providing clarity for everybody engaging with the system, that was really important. And so, that's, I suppose, in terms of the commencements to date, and it is very important that we're commencing the provisions of that Act on a phased basis, because we want to make sure everybody involved and those who play the key roles in terms of actually delivering, on a day-to-day basis, of course, that those working in the sector can make sure that that's a managed transition. So, we still have a live functioning planning system. It's really important that is maintained and protected, and that the change happens in a way that I suppose we can all have a line of sight on what's changing and when, insofar as that's possible. So in terms of the commencements that have happened to date, we've commenced, I suppose, the first kind of maybe key commencement related to the changes to what was on board Pleanála and is now on Comisiún Pleanála, because some of those aspects in terms of being ready, the organisation itself being ready to take on the other changes that will come as we roll out the rest of the legislation was really crucial. And that's gone really, really well. And, the Comisiún have really taken that new role on in a very positive manner, and we're really seeing the changes. And I think everybody across the system and stakeholders are seeing what the impacts, the positive impacts of that are. The next key part for us in terms of commencement was the part 3, the plan-led piece, and really that shaping what then happens next, and ultimately, informing decision making. And that was a clear priority for us, that plan-led nature of the system was being reinforced. So we've already commenced aspects relating to the national planning framework, the regional strategies and national planning statements. And I touched on that earlier, going forward, further policy to enhance or flesh out the key objectives of the national planning framework will be in the form of national planning statements. And that's a big programme of work, of course, as we now move into that space of updating and replacing the current suite of Section 28 ministerial planning guidelines over time. And on again, a phased and managed basis. And then the next phase is I suppose, where things are becoming, more real for those engaging at local authority level in terms of the development plans and local plans side of things. And I suppose that in itself is complex. And, as we transition from the 2000 Act into the 2024 Act, at a time when, of course, there's a big focus on making sure that we get the current development plans updated as quickly as possible to reflect the housing requirements of the updated national planning framework. Government has been very clear about that being an urgent priority. We also need to allow some clear pathway into the transition to the 10-year plans under the 2024 Act. And maybe that's where I'll pick up. You referenced, Sean, the fact that we've already amended provisions, or there was an Amendment Act earlier this year. So in July of this year, an Amendment Act to bring in some of the transitional provisions of the new Act into play as quickly as possible. In particular, areas such as judicial review, and that's an area of focus, obviously, for government at the moment, to try and manage in an efficient way judicial review proceedings in planning cases and provide clarity as much as possible and as early as possible in that space. But also, I suppose, look at now the need for further changes as we transition into the new provisions on the plan making side of things under the new Act. And so we are now looking at further transitional arrangements that will, again, clarify that pathway through into the 10-year plans under the the new Act and looking at, the potential for local authorities to extend the duration of their current development plans as we allow that space for that transition to happen in a managed way. There are other changes also being looked at as part of that piece of legislation that is now being drafted, to facilitate that transition to the new provisions of the Act to come in as quickly as possible, but in a way that is managed, working with the regional assemblies also as part of that process in terms of other transitional elements that require updating in order to refine that.
Three things that have got a lot of attention. One is rezoning and zoning and all that sort of stuff. So when are people, planners, members of the public aware of like that? When is the kind of, and I know a lot of work is underway, but when is that expected to, I suppose, happen? Or is there going to be a big bag thing? Or is this going to be done on obviously local authorities are doing their own work in it, but what is the expectation about whatever changes to zoning need to happen? When are they expected to be done? And then I suppose the other two things that there's been a lot of attention of is JR. So again, when are they likely to start seeing the impacts of the JR provisions which have been commenced or maybe are being amended coming in? And then the last thing is, when are people going to start, maybe not see the end product of a 10-year development plan, but when are people going to actually, when are local authorities going to have to start drafting these 10-year development plans with the new timelines?
Sure, yeah. I'll start with the zoning one because I suppose that's already underway, as you've mentioned, Sean. And I suppose the urgency around the challenge that we're all facing in terms of, trying to get as much housing supply coming on stream as quickly as possible is clear. The revised National Planning Framework in April set the path for that, with the updated projections around population housing implications, and then the issuing of the NPF implementation housing growth requirements guidelines in July followed on from that, and I suppose fleshed that out in further detail for the local authorities. And I suppose the very clear direction from government is that the development plans that are there need to be updated as quickly as possible to reflect those figures and allow that scope, and with a real focus, I suppose, not just on figures themselves, but in terms of deliverability, making sure that obviously where zonings are being undertaken for residential development, that there's a clear eye to, what's deliverable because of the urgency around that supply coming on stream. So I suppose that, the local authorities are all engaging in that process. We've been engaging with them, and I suppose in terms of that pathway towards seeing the plans being updated, a number of local authorities, I think it's 5, have formally started a variation process as of this week to commence the process of updating their plans, and a good few more local authorities have prepared chief executive reports to set out the proposed approach. And so we're now, over the next number of months, going to see all of that play out in the system. And of course, the transition from one act to another will mean, that some local authorities will be undertaking the variations under the 2024 Act. It's largely the same approach, but, slightly different provisions, of course, and we'll be working with the local authorities to support them in that process. And have already done extensive training with the local government sector on the provisions of the Part 3 part of the Act. And so that's, I suppose, a really critical and priority area of focus for all of us at the moment is trying to make sure that process is as quick, but as possible, but that it reflects the I suppose the level of need that's there in terms of meeting those updated requirements coming out of the National Planning Framework. And then in terms of judicial review, the Amendment Act that I referenced that was passed in July looked to try to bring in the provisions of Chapter 1 of Part 9, which is the judicial review part of the 2024 Act, as quickly as possible for decisions made under the 2024 Act. What we're now looking at is trying to, I suppose, bring those provisions into play as soon as possible for decisions made under the 2000 Act. But obviously there's some detail to work through on that, and I suppose that's one of the areas of work at the moment in terms of making sure that that's clear for everybody engaging in the system. And of course, there are other elements related to judicial review also, that we're working across government with colleagues on in relation to the other part of the chapter 2 of part 9, which relates to the scale of fees and environmental legal costs financial assistance mechanism, and our colleagues in the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment are playing a key role in that too. So look, there is a lot of work ongoing, and of course, in particular in the space of judicial review, there are a number of departments involved beyond just from a planning perspective. And then your last question, the 10-year development plans. Yes, so that's something that I think, the overall intention is, as I mentioned, I suppose to start that process as soon as possible, but also to make sure that that can be done in a managed way. And that's something that we're now engaging with stakeholders on, and in particular, obviously, the local government sector in terms of exactly what timelines need to be factored in for that. Obviously, there are the timelines are going to be critical because a number of local authorities are already in or are embarking on, I suppose, the review period for their current plans, and we need to have a clear path that makes sure that sufficient time is allowed, that they can extend their plans for an appropriate time period as we transition into the 10-year plan. So that there isn't a firm date or timeline on that yet, and that's something we're working through.
And then just three other quick things maybe before we move on from the kind of legislation piece is some other highlights maybe of the legislation. One would be the status of the regional renewable kind of targets and where that work is going. And then when people can start to expect or might start to see national planning statements and kind of what they feel like or what's being prioritised there. And then the last thing I think, which is of interest to people, and people will have seen stuff about the exempted development regs, but how much, obviously we know this with the 2000 Act, the regs were as long, I think, if not longer than the legislation. I'm sure we're going to be having the same again. So how much secondary legislation are people likely to start seeing in the next one?
Sure, yeah. I'll start with the renewable energy side of things. And that was, I suppose, not only in terms of the legislation itself, but also in terms of the revised national planning framework. That was one of the key areas of change for us, I suppose, since the previous Act and the previous NPF. Things had moved on so much in the area of climate policy, but also some of the, domestically and at EU level, of course. And it was really important that we were able to reflect that, and I suppose bring in the national targets for renewable electricity into the planning system in a very, I suppose, formal way through the NPF, and obviously then through the system, that the regional assemblies have a key role to play in terms of translating that national figure, into we've as part of the NPF translated into regional allocations. And now the regional assemblies are working on translating that to, I suppose, the local level capacity allocations that will inform the plan making at the local authority level through the development plan. And so that's a really critical piece of work, and I suppose for the regional assemblies, and we're engaging with them on that in terms of supporting them from the perspective of the general approach. Of course, it is for each regional assembly to then undertake that exercise as part of their own strategies. But in terms of what that means, ultimately, I suppose it's reinforcing that plan-led approach that I mentioned earlier, and being very clear through the regional strategy and then ultimately the local authority development plan, where we are planning for commercial scale wind and solar development, and some of the other kind of key supporting policy objectives that feed into that, and I suppose there's an interaction there, of course, with the wind energy policy side of things as well, through what would have been the wind energy development guidelines and will now be a national planning statement, which we're also working on with our colleagues in the Department of Climate. So that's a really key change, I think, in terms of the role that the system plays in delivering government policy. But from a from a really important perspective that clarity is there within the planning system on a plan-led basis, and that informs decision making, and that's, I suppose, has been our priority from the start of that process. In terms of the national planning statements, and I've just touched on the wind energy one, but of course there's a suite of them that we need to update, and indeed probably add to now at this point in terms of priority areas for national planning statements, and I suppose it is a significant body of work, and it is definitely the case that we won't be in a position to do them all at the one time, and I think it's a case of, I suppose, having key priorities, and developing on those. And I suppose in terms of when we're likely to see the first one, there's a few that I suppose have already been signalled for various reasons. I suppose looking at the government's new housing action plan, delivering homes, building communities, that already signals a number of national planning statements in the space of rural housing, Gaeltacht planning, short-term letting, for example. And so, we've set out some timelines associated with them, over next year and the following year. And then, of course, the Accelerating Infrastructure Task Force report and action plan also signals the ambition to prepare a national planning statement on critical infrastructure. And I suppose that's, very clearly an area of focus for government. And we'll be working with colleagues across government and, of course, the key stakeholders involved in that also to provide that very clear policy signal, which will just build on, I suppose, the clear policy support in the NPF that's already there, but I suppose to reinforce the need and the urgency around critical infrastructure. When we're looking at transport, electricity and water, and the key role that the associated infrastructure plays in supporting a huge range of government policy objectives, including, of course, the supply of housing. So, look, that's a very clear area of focus for us, and there are others that are going to be important too in the residential and housing space, and of course, from the perspective of delivering increased housing supply. So look, there's a few areas there that I've touched on in particular, but of course we're looking at all of the current Section 28 guidelines and how we can approach updating and replacing them in due course.
Is the next Section 28 guidelines to drop going to be a national planning statement? Obviously there's been coverage and discussion of things like the apartment guidelines, so and what the next iteration of that is going to look like. But I suppose the overall question is what is the next new thing that's going to come out of things like the government housing plan, or is it iterative stuff? Because obviously the apartment standards had started before that, the rezoning work had started before the housing plan. What's the next new thing that's going to hit coming out of it, or is it going to be more iterative type stuff that's already underway or people shouldn't be surprised by?
In terms of the housing plan specifically, I think, look, everybody reading it will see that there is a lot in there that picks up on what's already being done in terms of the new Planning Act, the NPF, that side of things is, that work is already underway, as we've been talking about. But probably some of the other maybe key areas of focus and maybe developing out and maybe building on what we've already done, but probably giving it a renewed area of focus for me, and which is a really important one, is the new Urban Communities Task Force, because I suppose that's where we can really see the very clear link between all of the topics that we've been touching on. It's clearly a priority in terms of supporting housing supply, but it brings in, I suppose, the role that the planning system can play in terms of that master planning, that plan-led nature of an approach to development, but bringing in infrastructure in particular. I suppose that's something that we've learned, across the board over the last couple of decades, the importance of having clarity from the outset as to the infrastructural requirements for these areas to be able to be developed at the scale and speed that is now required to meet the housing the housing ambition that's there in terms of the overall numbers, but in a way that we can work across government, across infrastructure providers, and with all of the key stakeholders playing their their part in that process, so whether that's, the local authorities obviously have a really crucial role to play in that in terms of the statutory planning elements and it's really, I suppose, about bringing together all of the work that's there in the Act, urban development zones, priority area plans, and the work that we've been doing with colleagues in the Department of Transport and key stakeholders in looking at transport orientated development, and that obviously informed elements of the revised NPF as well. And so bringing all of that work together and now taking it on to the next phase and the next stage, I think it's a really exciting prospect. And I suppose looking at, what can that look like in terms of, we can obviously look at other jurisdictions and the approaches that they've taken, and we have done, and we'll do more of that as we develop out the approach. But it's really, I suppose, that importance of bringing all of the stakeholders together in a very coordinated approach that looks at prioritising, what is the scale of ambition in these locations and what's required in order to deliver it. And I suppose that really, I think, for me, reflects the role that the planning system and that the planner can play in bringing all of those elements together. So for me, I suppose, coming out of the housing plan, that's a really significant area to build on. And then there's also, I suppose, maybe an element that we, as part of our day-to-day job as planners working across the system, we're involved in also, at maybe the lower scale in terms of housing activation, but is absolutely crucially important in terms of vacancy, dereliction and regeneration and supporting those efforts. And again, that's an area that we've been working very closely with colleagues in our department from a housing perspective, but also across government and again with the local government sector in particular, in looking at various different initiatives, whether it may be funding programmes, providing staffing resources, or indeed now tax measures to try and really tackle those issues so that we can bring on housing supply, but also, deal with issues around vacancy and dereliction that are, that have much broader implications than just the housing units that it can deliver. They're really crucial in terms of, I suppose, reactivating our town centres and our towns and our villages across the country, and the broader positive impacts that can deliver. So I suppose just touching on a few areas of the housing plan, there are some of the elements that I think from a planning perspective are kind of going to be critically important as we move forward.
And then something else that was published recently that I suppose made a big splash, and certainly there was a lot of commentary before and after it, is the Accelerating Infrastructure Task Force. And I think maybe half or so of the actions are something that sits with your department in different ways, and at the same time it's not a Department of Housing document. It's a deeper document, and we won't go through all those actions. But I suppose some of them did stand out for people. There's a discussion about consistency in decision making, and you did mention the planning performance framework. But what does that mean in practical terms? Because I get a sense that when certain actors are talking about consistency in decision making, I think they mean something different and something much more prescriptive maybe than the reality of day-to-day decision making and planning. But what is that kind of discussion about consistency in decision making, and how does it feed into work that you were already doing, and where is that going to go next?
No, I think you've reflected it well, Sean. Like, I think obviously the whole role of the planner, the planning system in decisions is, of course, balancing up all of the elements that have to be taken into account. And I think for me, what this is about is how we approach decision making. It's not about the decision itself. We can't prejudge what the decision on any planning application should be. I mentioned earlier, of course, the one of the other actions in the plan is a national planning statement on critical infrastructure, to build on the clear policy support that's already there in the NPF for infrastructure projects. And I suppose that feeding in from a policy perspective is a very clear signal about the importance of critical infrastructure. But there's still a need, of course, on a project by project basis for each decision to factor in all of the different elements that require consideration. And it's about how we approach that. And I suppose it's a consistent approach to decision making, not consistent decisions. So it's about, and I think it is really looking at, training, expertise, resourcing, the supports for the system that are required to make it run and operate efficiently, and I suppose all of that may be coming through the performance framework, and so a piece of work that we are embarking on is, and we'll be engaging with stakeholders on is this idea of a planning excellence framework. What does a well-functioning planning system look like and feel like, and how can we improve? And I think we all, I think, need to acknowledge that everything is changing, and we also need to be willing to change and adapt and look at areas for improvement, innovation, inefficiency, and how can we continue to improve the way that the system works to make sure that it I suppose does what it needs to do, but in a way that manages all of those competing priorities, but also in a way that I suppose delivers decisions in an efficient manner, but also in a manner that appropriately recognises the things it needs to take into account. So it's about how we approach having all of the inputs there to make the system run well, and run efficiently and robustly, and of course from a policy perspective, acknowledging that the critical infrastructure is important and required.
And you talked about the role of planning and the planner in terms of balance and judgment and things like that. How does that sit with the other action that's in there about this emergency legislation and emergency powers and maybe similarly kind of changes to thresholds or proposed changes to thresholds and things like that? I think previously we've discussed, and you did mention the expanding role of the division and the Department of Housing. And of planners working across government and in agencies where there was never planners before. So in one way, you'd feel that planning is expanding its reach, but then is the intention or what is your interpretation of it, or what do you think is intended by it, or what might it look like? Is planning withdrawing, or is there kind of a hollowing out from planning when it comes to some other kind of decisions which would traditionally be within the planning system? What does that look like, or what have the discussions been about what that emergency powers acceleration of decision on certain things look like?
There's probably a mixture of elements coming into that, in that we already within planning legislation do have emergency provisions. There is a means, and obviously the detail of the actions that are set out in the Accelerating Infrastructure Task Force report and plan are now all to be worked through, and so I suppose in terms of exactly what that looks like, I can't comment at this point in time, and we will be working, of course, with our colleagues across government as those proposals are developed. But it's about, I suppose, recognising that where something is critically important from an infrastructural perspective, that there is a means to it being delivered in certain circumstances, and I suppose that's, as I say, not new, and that there are already provisions in the Planning Act indeed for that to happen in certain circumstances. So look, the detail is, as I say, to be worked through, but it's not about hollowing out. It's about, I suppose, having the ability to be able to deliver these projects where they're required, and making sure that obviously there's a clear path, but also, I suppose, maybe perhaps more of a focus, and you'll see it through some of the other actions in the plan also, on accelerated timelines and improved coordination. And I suppose there is a challenge across the system, not just for infrastructure indeed, but in terms of the various different types of consents, licenses, permits that are required for projects, and also the interaction that all of those regulatory processes have with EU environmental legislation, and looking to do that in a way that is more efficient and streamlined, and I suppose can achieve the outcomes that are required as efficiently as possible. And it's fair to say that's not just a domestic ambition in Ireland. That's across Europe. And look, we're seeing now, very clearly from EU level, the need to streamline and accelerate permitting processes, and that's something we're going to have to manage, I think. And look, it's another area of change for all of us. But I suppose the overall ambition in terms of in addition to delivering critical infrastructure projects, is of course, looking at it from a competitiveness perspective, making sure we have a well-functioning permitting system. And by permitting, that's more than just planning. Of course, it does bring into account all of the other different types of consents and permits that are also required to deliver these types of projects. So we've seen some of that already through, for example, the Renewable Energy Directive, the Net Zero Industry Act, Critical Raw Materials Act coming from the EU. And there is more now coming from EU level in terms of, I suppose, sectoral policy areas and the key role that permitting plays in efficient delivery of those. And I suppose as part of that, the planning system, of course, has a key role to play. But it's probably moving beyond that sectoral level now into a wider space, I think. What we're seeing coming from the EU around simplification more broadly in order to achieve that competitiveness objective. And just this week, indeed, the EU Commission have published proposals for an environmental omnibus, which looks at various different proposals for streamlining and simplification and speeding up of processes, including in particular a proposal relating to environmental assessments. So, of course, environmental assessment playing a key role in the permitting process and being integrated to our decision making. That's something that we will be involved in, and I suppose in terms of the overall ambition to have faster permitting and faster environmental assessment as part of that. What does that look like, and how would we need to respond? So look, there are, I suppose, some of the actions maybe in the Accelerating Infrastructure Task Force are kind of coming from the same perspective. I think it's looking at of course our obligations from an EU member state perspective in terms of how we've transposed legislation. Can we make changes? Can we make I suppose further refinements that will achieve that overall objective of improving certainty for everybody engaging in the system, while obviously doing things in a way that meets those ultimate policy objectives of proper planning and sustainable development.
Given where you sit, and this could be a narrative piece, and this could just be what I'm picking up, but where you sit, can they be reconciled, two opposing views, just generally on this? I suppose one view, which is very uncomfortable maybe with this discussion of deregulation and idea of consistency in decision making and potential changes to judicial review and what it means to people's rights and things like that. So there's discomfort out there, and there's various people who have concerns about things that maybe are coming, or things that maybe are planned, or even just maybe the trajectory which is talking about deregulation. And then on the other hand, you have, I suppose, very, very vocal groups talking about gold-plated EU legislation and stuff taking too long, and the system, and the rezoning sort of happened kind of yesterday, and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes do you feel that if kind of those two very opposing narratives have a problem, that you're probably finding the right balance, or maybe both of those being overly amplified, and actually just from the stakeholders that you're talking about, people do think regionally, locally, nationally, and in a European context, we're actually kind of doing okay and kind of ploughing our own kind of path through all this sort of stuff? Or how do we compare to other jurisdictions in Europe who are, encountering, I suppose, similar pressures?
It's a very interesting topic and very, I suppose, live at the moment, of course. And I think, we've been very clear in our legislation about that balance that's required, in terms of having a very open and transparent system, but that works efficiently, and providing maybe a more streamlined approach, but that obviously respects the involvement of participants in the system. And look, that's something that I think it's fair to say. Look, we'll always be keeping the legislation under review, because there is a need to make sure that we adapt and respond to change as necessary, as I've mentioned previously. But I suppose it's about trying to make sure that we're balancing all of those interests and coming up, proposals that seek to achieve that balance, and that reinforce the role that the planning system can play as part of that. And look, so I suppose it's not necessarily one versus the other. It's looking at all of the interests and how we can balance them. That's I suppose the role of the planning system ultimately, is to achieve that balance. But as we move forward, I think that's the key, is to recognise that maybe some things do need to change, and we need to consider what that change might look like, and weigh up how, I suppose, what role planning can play as part of that.
And then before we finish, I wanted to look ahead to 2026 and ask you two things in particular. One is going back to the regs and the implementation of the 2024 Act as amended and as might be amended in the future. What's the next kind of big piece of regs that people can expect to see, or what's the next steps to things like the exempted development regulations, which were in public consultation? What's the next kind of big bang there? I imagine some of them are quite kind of technical, whereas some could be more substantial. So what can people see there first?
Yeah, so that's something we're working through at the moment. And look, we had a really good level of engagement with the consultation and are now working through, the submissions and obviously engaging with the Minister on what that looks like in terms of developing the proposals. It's another big piece of work, and it's a case of maybe how we bring that forward in a way that recognises, I suppose, the scale of work that's involved for everybody, not just from our perspective in terms of drafting legislation, of course, but in terms of those operating the system. And it's I think, obviously the intention is to next year, that's early next year, that's the priority area as we move on in terms of commencement of the Act. There's a very clear interaction there, of course, between the exempted development regulations and the commencement of Part 4, which will be the next big phase of commencements for us. And once that part of the Act is commenced, the vast majority of the legislation will have been commenced and in play in the system. And so, look, that's, I think, something that working with stakeholders across the board is a very clear area of focus for us, because we're, I suppose, moving from the plan making space into the decision making space. And in terms of regulations, beyond just the exempted development regulations, which, clearly there's been a lot of discussion about, in particular, probably maybe from a housing and infrastructure perspective, and for obvious reasons, they're priority areas of focus for us. But across the board, what other changes to the exempted development legislation are justified at this point in time? And look, we're looking at all of that, of course. But there's obviously secondary regulations also required in terms of Part 4, and it's bringing all of the actors involved in that, and particularly those operating the system and the legislation on a day-to-day basis. We've talked about judicial review, but of course it's only a small minority of decisions that end up in court, thankfully. The vast majority of decisions are made and in a very efficient manner on a day-to-day basis by the local authorities and Comisiún Plála, and perhaps we don't hear enough about maybe the positives and what the system is doing well. And I suppose for me, that's something that, as we go into next year, I think perhaps we can maybe all work together on. But I suppose in terms of the legislation itself, Part 4 and everything that goes with that, both in terms of exempted development and the secondary legislation and training, with the local government system in particular, is going to be crucially important, because what we all want to avoid is I suppose having practical or implementation issues, once that commencement happens. So it's very much trying to work through that together in a productive way, so that we build on our well-functioning system.
We talked about Europe, and obviously at the second half of 2026, Ireland has the EU presidency. So what does that mean for you? Planning is, on paper anyway, maybe still a national competence, but what sort of priorities are you going to be working on in the second half of 2026? And I imagine there's a lot of gearing up to that before we get there. So yeah, what's it like working ahead of, and then what are you planning for the presidency?
Planning is a member state competence. However, I think increasingly, we're becoming, I suppose, fully integrated with the delivery of a lot of key EU policy objectives. I've already mentioned, I suppose, the simplification agenda and permitting, and I think that's going to be a key area of focus actually during our presidency. And so we're already involved in feeding into those various proposals that are coming from the Commission, and will be over the next number of months, I think, involved in those discussions, negotiations, and it will be very interesting. A lot of the legislation at EU level is now happening at a very, very, very fast pace, so it's hard at this stage to appreciate perhaps even where some of that will land during our own presidency, but certainly we will be involved. I think it's safe to say. But even leaving aside that perhaps slightly newer area of focus at EU level, we also have a role to play in terms of preparation for the presidency on a day-to-day basis. We do a lot of work and a lot of EU engagement with other member states and institutions and organisations on an ongoing basis. In particular in the area of urban planning and regional planning. So we will be responsible for hosting the other member states for a series of meetings during the presidency, and so obviously preparing for that as we speak, and other organisations such as working with colleagues in the EUI, ESPON, URBACT. I'll be chairing the URBACT meetings for next year, both the first half of the year and during our own presidency. So there's a huge amount of preparation going on for all of that engagement on changes to EU policy in relation to cities and the new EU cities agenda. So we will be actively involved in all of those negotiations and chairing them, of course, next year, and involved also on some of maybe the territorial cohesion side as part of that responsibility too, and that feeding in very much to the new funding arrangements and the new multi-annual financial framework at EU level. So we're involved in all those negotiations and discussions, and it's a very interesting time to be hosting the presidency, because a lot of those key decisions will be made actually, I think, during our presidency period.
Yeah, so some of those phrases bring me back to planning theory and European planning and stuff like that. But one last question then, Claragh, is looking back over your career so far, is there one thing or one project or one outcome that you're particularly proud of?
It's probably maybe two things I'll focus on. The first is probably just from a personal perspective. I suppose being the first female chief planner in Ireland, I'm very proud of as a personal achievement. I think it's something that I suppose I've really appreciated all of the mentoring and support I've had throughout my own career. I mentioned from the very beginning, I think that played a crucial role in I suppose allowing me to develop a very really varied and broad level of expertise. That brought me to the role I'm now in, and it's a role that I really enjoy. So I suppose that's a very proud achievement for me personally, to be in this role and to be able to try to make change. That I suppose is important, and I think the role that planning plays, and has become increasingly important and recognised. And being involved in that, I suppose, is something that I'm very proud of, and always willing to ask questions and learn. I think is something that I've learned throughout my own career, and certainly in terms of trying to support and mentor my own team and others. It's every day is a learning day, I think, for all of us, and I suppose it's maybe reflecting on that as we do our day-to-day jobs, but always being willing to listen to new ideas and positive change, and maybe something, I suppose, in terms of one specific outcome of a piece of work that I was involved in. I think the residential zoned land tax for me was something that was really interesting. I was involved in from the outset, and it's funny sometimes when you're involved in a piece of work, you don't perhaps stand back to think about it from the kind of maybe the broader perspective, the higher level perspective. But I do a lot of engagement with colleagues in other jurisdictions, whether it's maybe at EU level I've mentioned, but also those closer to home in the UK. And when I explained to them how the RZLT works and the role that it plays, it's something that they've all been really interested in hearing about and trying to maybe learn from Ireland, which is very positive, and it really shows, I suppose, the firm basis of the statutory planning system, and that allowing, that providing a basis for a land activation measure, and of course, as part of that work, of course, working with colleagues across government, because it's a tax, but it being very firmly rooted in planning policy, it is something that I suppose speaks to maybe some of the things I've touched on earlier in terms of that broad role that planning can play, and collaboration, and looking at all of maybe the different levers that we can deploy to be able to in this case increase housing supply, and that coming to bear now, and I think having impacts across the system is something that I'm also quite proud of.
Claragh, thanks a million for joining me.
Thanks, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.